I'm not the kind of woman people send flowers to, not because I don't like them, but because I've made a life out of being somewhere people can't find. I end the middle of nowhere, behind a lens, under the weight of stars so bright they drown out the noise of everything I left behind. My name is Sophie Langston. I'm 32 years old, and I live out of a canvas bag, a camera case, and a tent that smells like dust and film chemicals. I don't belong in boardrooms. I don't belong in brunch photos. I belong here, on the edge of somewhere dangerous. In land that breathes louder than I do, where survival isn't a metaphor. It's a sound. A shadow. A golden eye that blinks once in the grass and never looks away. That's where I saw him, the lion. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it began, with a warning I ignored. They told me not to camp near the Duma Hollow. It wasn't written in any guidebook, but the locals of Maasai herders, truck drivers, quiet old men with cracked lips and wiser eyes, told me the stories just the same. That place is not yours. Even the lions don't sleep easy there. Sometimes the wind carries more than dust. But warnings don't translate well for people like me. Not because we're reckless, but because when you've already lost so much, the fear of what might happen doesn't outweigh the fear of going home empty. I came to photograph lions. Not from a jeep. Not through binoculars. I wanted real. I wanted close. I didn't expect him. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp in a clearing near a dry riverbed, far from where tourists were allowed. The trees here were taller, the shadows deeper, the silence broken only by the occasional cry of something just out of view. My tent, a battered khaki dome with patched seams, was wedged between two acacia trees. My camera gear was laid out with reverence. Tripods. Lenses. Night sensors. Batteries. Extra SD cards. A steel thermos that doubled as a weapon, if necessary, and the rifle. I kept it locked. Always. I didn't want to use it, I just wanted to watch, but by nightfall, I knew something was already watching me. It started with a stillness, not silence, stillness. Even the wind stopped moving. The leaves held their breath. The usual chorus of insects thinned into a low, humming absence. That's what made me step outside the tent, barefoot, camera slung around my neck like a shield. That's when I saw the eyes, low to the ground. Gold like flame. Fixed on me from the tall grass near the tree line, not glowing, not glinting, not watching. My hand went to the rifle case instinctively, but I didn't touch it, because he wasn't crouching, not he wasn't hunting, not he was standing, tall, still, unmoving, like a statue that had waited too long to be seen. I didn't breathe. Not fully. I just raised my camera, snapped once, the shutter sounded too loud. He blinked, then disappeared, not ran, just melted into the black, like he'd never been there at all. I should have packed up that night. I should have driven back to the station, called it a fluke, gone somewhere safer, but I didn't, because something in those eyes hadn't felt threatening. It had felt personal. The next morning, I developed the image on my old portable screen, sipping bitter coffee with shaking hands. There he was, perfect silhouette. Thick mane. Battle-scarred flank. And those eyes, piercing even through a digital screen. I enlarged the photo, and froze, because right behind him, in the grass, another set of prints, boot prints afresh, leading toward my tent. But only his paw prints came out. I didn't mention that part in the reports. I emailed to the team. They wouldn't believe me anyway. They thought I was chasing inspiration. They didn't know I was running from everything else, from the man I left back in Boston, from the grief I couldn't name, from the version of me that used to need people to feel real. Here, in the dust and breath of the wild, I didn't have to explain myself. I only had to survive. That night, I left the flap unzipped, not wide. Just enough. I told myself it was for the air. But part of me, some feral part that had been whispering louder each day, wanted to know if he would come back. If he'd come closer. If what I'd seen in his eyes had been recognition. The hours passed in darkness, the insects returned. So did the wind. A hyena cackled somewhere far off. I lay still, wrapped in a blanket, listening. Then the sound shifted. No footsteps, just wait, something massive moving. Breath outside the tent, close. I turned to the flap, heart thundering in my chest, eyes wide and burning, and there he was, the lion, mane dusted in moonlight. Body too big for the entrance. Muscles rippling like a river of fur and shadow. He looked at me, not hungrily, not curiously, just looked, and then, he entered. He didn't growl, didn't rush, just pushed the flap aside with his massive head, stepped in, and lowered himself onto the floor of the tent with a groan that sounded almost human. I didn't move. Couldn't not. He lay down fully, head on his massive paws, sides heaving gently as he took up the entire tent. My knees pressed against the canvas wall. My supplies crushed. My world reduced to heat and breath and the rumble of a creature who could end me in a second. But didn't. He closed his eyes and slept. That was the first night he stayed, not in the shadows, not outside, but with me, and I didn't scream, I didn't run, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid, not of him, not even of the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I don't mean I lay there, tossing and turning. I mean I didn't dare close my eyes, not with a full-grown lion stretched across the floor of my tent like he owned the place, like I was the guest, like he had simply come home. His breathing had been rhythmic, slow, deep, grounding. The kind of sound that could calm you if it weren't coming from a 400-pound predator curled against your boots. I sat in my sleeping bag, knees hugged to my chest, afraid that even a whisper of movement would shift something I couldn't undo. But the strangest part wasn't fear. It was peace. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't growl. He didn't even look at me again. He just stayed, and when the first gray light filtered through the canvas and touched his mane, he opened his eyes, lifted his head, and stood. I held my breath as he moved, not toward me, but toward the flap. He nudged it open with his head, then paused, looked back once, as if checking that I was still watching, then walked out, and vanished into the morning fog. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't email the foundation, or radio the rangers, or write it in my travel log. I told myself no one would believe me, but that wasn't the truth. I didn't want them to know, because whatever was happening between that lion and me, it felt private, sacred, untouchable. The next night, he didn't come, and it felt like grief. I stayed awake until dawn, every hour stretching like wire inside my chest. I told myself he'd gone, that it had been a one-time thing. A strange moment I wasn't meant to understand, but on the third night, just after moonrise, I heard him, the breath first. Then the soft drag of paws in the sand. When the flap lifted, I didn't flinch. I just moved my backpack to the side, clearing space. He stepped inside without hesitation and lay down in the exact same spot as before, shoulder to the right wall, paws near my feet, and slept. He came back the next night, and the next, and the next. By the end of the week, I'd stopped pretending this was normal, but I still didn't know why he was doing it. Why me? Why this tent? By day, I carried on as usual, tracking prides, setting up remote cameras, cataloging behaviors for the wildlife NGO that had sent me here in the first place. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. I started reviewing all my memory cards obsessively, looking for patterns that he wasn't part of the main pride. I was sure of that now. He had the marks of a loner, scars on his flank, older injuries that hadn't healed cleanly, a split in his left ear. He was massive, even for a male. But there was something in his posture, calm, confident, alert, that made me think he wasn't lost. He was choosing me. One evening, I stepped outside the tent right before sunset and found him already sitting there, not lying. Sitting, waiting. His amber eyes followed me as I poured water into a basin to wash my hands. You're early, I said. He didn't blink. I shook my head. You're not supposed to be doing this, you know. He stretched, one long, slow extension of muscle and power, and let out a breath that sounded like wind over gravel. I didn't ask him to come inside. I didn't have to. He stayed closer to me that night, not touching, but nearer. I could hear the subtle shifts in his breathing, the occasional grunt in his throat as he dreamed. He didn't act like a predator. He acted like something older than instinct. Like he was guarding something. Me, or the space I created by being here. On the fifth night, I had a dream, a strange one. I was standing in the middle of the savannah, barefoot, camera in hand. The wind was high, the grass waist deep. And in the distance, the lion stood watching me, not from the shadows, but from a mound of earth crowned with bones. He opened his mouth, not to roar, but to speak, but no sound came out, only light. I woke with tears in my eyes, and his flank pressed against my foot. Why now? The tent smelled like him, dust and fur and wildness. White gear case was permanently shoved against the wall to make room for him. I'd stopped zipping the flap entirely. And somehow, the longer he stayed, the less I felt like this was strange, the more I felt like it was right, like something I didn't know I needed had finally arrived. But on the seventh night, everything changed. It started with the silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that means something's wrong. I stepped out of the tent at twilight and scanned the tree line. No lion, no sound, even the insects had gone still. Then I saw the prints. Fresh, not paws, boots, heading straight toward camp from the far ridge, and they didn't come from any direction that made sense, not from the station. Not from the road, they came from the restricted zone, where poachers had been reported weeks ago. I reached for the rifle case, heart pounding, hands slick with sweat. I'd never fired it, not even once. I didn't know if I could, but just as I gripped the lock, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, not behind me, beside me. Yet he was there, the lion. I hadn't heard him approach. He stood tall now, mane bristling, teeth bared, not at me but at the ridge. The message was clear, someone else was here, and he wouldn't let them come closer. We stood there together, side by side in the dying light, me with shaking hands, him as still as stone. I never saw who it was, but whoever had come near camp must have seen him, because no one stepped into the clearing and no one called out. And after a long, tense moment, the presence was gone. That night, he came into the tent like always, but he didn't lie down right away. Yet he stood at the entrance, ears twitching, eyes scanning. Only when the wind shifted and the night returned to normal did he relax. He came to my side and settled slowly, like the weight of him had doubled. I placed my hand near his paw, not touching, just close. I don't know what you are, I whispered. Protector? Ghost? Guardian? He exhaled heavily and closed his eyes. I didn't dream that night, I just listened to his breathing and slept like I belonged. The truth is, I meant to leave it closed. That night was different. The air had a strange density to it, heavy and metallic, like rain was close but hadn't made up its mind. Even the stars felt muffled, as if the sky was holding something back. I'd gone through my normal motions, securing the gear, boiling water, packing notes into the waterproof case. I zipped up the tent without thinking, almost too early, like I didn't want the night to begin. But later, when I stepped out to brush dust from the lens caps, I forgot I left the flap open, and I think he knew there was a stillness in the dark, but not the peaceful kind. It felt, watched, that old sense of being observed, of something just beyond the fire's reach, something ancient and patient, returned full force. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, heart already preparing itself for the sound I'd come to recognize like a second pulse, and there it was, the breath, not a growl, not a roar. Just the low, steady exhale of something that knew exactly where I was, and had no intention of hiding anymore. I turned slowly. Yet he stood at the edge of the clearing, massive, moonlit, unmoving, but this time, he didn't wait for me to step back. He came forward, deliberate, calm, certain, not in a stalk, not in silence, but in a way that said, this is mine too. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My body felt like it was made of tension and dust. But I didn't run. I didn't reach for the rifle. I just backed up, step by step, until I was inside the tent, until I was seated on the floor, knees pulled close, eyes locked on the opening, and then, he entered. He didn't hesitate. Not this time. He pushed the canvas flap aside with a shoulder and stepped into the space like it had been made for him, like I was the one borrowing it. He didn't sniff. Didn't pace. He knew this place now. He turned once, lowered his massive frame to the ground, and lay down right across from me, taking up the entire tent. I stared at him in the flickering light of the solar lamp. His mane was flecked with dust, his ears twitching now and then with instinct. One long scar stretched across his shoulder, partially hidden beneath fur. His eyes were half closed, but he was watching me, and then, something happened I didn't expect. He groaned, not a roar, not a warning. A sound of effort, of rest. A sound so deeply normal that it cracked something inside me. It was the same sound my grandfather used to make when he settled into his chair after a long day on his feet. The sound of being allowed to relax. A lion was relaxing next to me, like he was home, like I was safe. I shifted slightly, just enough to grab my journal from the crate beside me. Normally, I wrote out every major event, but tonight, I didn't write facts. I wrote feelings. He's not just visiting anymore. He's staying. This isn't about survival. This is about trust. What happens when a wild thing chooses to share your space, not out of fear or dominance, but something else? He could destroy me, but instead, he chose not to. At some point, I must have dozed off, and I dreamt again, but not the same way. This time, I wasn't alone in the grass. I wasn't watching from afar. I was running, barefoot and breathless, through golden fields. And beside me, he ran too. Silent. Powerful. Present, not chasing with me, and when I stopped, panting and wild, he sat down next to me and lifted his eyes to the horizon. There were fires there, but he didn't flinch. I woke with my hand outstretched, resting near his massive paw, and he was still there, eyes open, watching me, that he hadn't moved all night neither. Had I? The morning came slowly, light seeped through the canvas in soft blue waves. Outside, birds began calling again. Life resumed, but inside that tent, everything had changed. I didn't need proof anymore. I didn't need photos, or explanations, or some scientific frame to put him in. I only needed his presence, the weight of him, the warmth, the way the world made sense when he was near. He stood eventually, stretched like a king, his tail swished once, brushing the edge of my bedroll. Then he turned to the flap, pushed it open, and stepped out into the morning as though the night meant nothing. But I knew better. The night had meant everything that day. I didn't track, I didn't hike, I didn't even log my notes. I just sat on a crate outside the tent, staring at the prints he'd left behind, heavy, confident, beautiful, and I whispered aloud what I hadn't dared say before. You're not just visiting, are you? The wind answered, but he didn't return, not yet. Later, just before sunset, I walked to the river's edge. The sun hung low, molten and golden, stretching light across the water like a path, and that's when I saw him, not in the shadows this time, but standing in the open, mane catching the wind, eyes fixed on me and not moving, not blinking. I raised my hand, not to take a photo, just to wave, and to my surprise, he dipped his head, slow, certain. A greeting. I whispered the name I'd been holding back, Mosi. It means firstborn in Swahili, but to me, it meant more. It meant only singular, chosen. He blinked once, then turned and walked into the trees. That night, I zipped the flap closed, and then, just before blowing out the lamp, I unzipped it again, because I knew he'd be back. I'd only packed the essentials: camera gear, 2 journals, the satellite phone, a folder of permits no one ever checked. I told myself it was just a quick relocation, 10 kilometers east, closer to the watering holes, more lion activity during daylight, but the truth was simpler. I was leaving because I was scared, not of him, of what I'd begun to feel, of how easy it had become to breathe only when he was near, and maybe of what might happen if one day he didn't come back. The morning sun rose hot and fast. My tent flaps fluttered as I rolled up sleeping mats and packed cables. I moved with discipline, like it was just another field day. Like I hadn't spent the last 8 nights sleeping beside a lion. My hand lingered on the corner of the tent, where his paw print had smudged the canvas, so I wiped it clean before I could think twice. I'd planned to leave just after noon, but the radio crackled before I could load the last of my supplies. It was Nyasha, one of the rangers from the outpost a few hours away. Static crackled as her voice broke through. Poacher activity. North quadrant, for confirmed, avoid forest perimeter, copy? My fingers clenched around the receiver. They were close, too close. I stood in the doorway of the tent, staring at the flat plain stretching out in all directions. The wind had changed again, coming from the south now. Dry, heavy with something I couldn't name, and I knew, in my gut, what that meant. He'd know too. I didn't see him all morning. The stillness had returned, dense and strange, but I felt him like the way your body knows when a storm is coming, not visible, but undeniable. By early afternoon, my gear was loaded. The Land Cruiser waited at the edge of the camp, its back door swinging open. I slung my camera bag over one shoulder and reached for the tent poles, and then, he appeared, like he'd risen from the dust itself. No sound, no warning. One moment, I was alone. The next, he was there, blocking the exit. Mosi stood directly between me and the vehicle, massive, solid, silent. He wasn't growling, he wasn't pacing. He just stood there, watching, and not like a lion watching prey, like a guardian watching something about to be taken away. My breath hitched. Mosi, I whispered. He didn't move but didn't blink. I took a cautious step forward, another. His ears flattened, just slightly. I froze, heart thundering. His eyes never left mine. This wasn't coincidence, this was choice. He was stopping me. I dropped the bag slowly, letting it fall between us. I have to go, I said aloud, like saying it would make it true. Still, he didn't move. The silence between us stretched so long I began to doubt myself. But then, a sound far off, sharp, metallic. A single gunshot. I flinched instinctively. So did Mosi, but only for a second. Then his body shifted, not toward the sound, but closer to me, protecting, and I understood he wasn't blocking me out of possession. He was keeping me here, because something out there wasn't safe. The sun dipped lower, the air turned orange. Still, I didn't move, either did he. We stood in that fading light like 2 sentinels caught between worlds. Finally, he turned, not away from me, but toward the trees, and walked, not far, Just to the edge of the brush, then he Saturday and waited. I didn't leave that night, I didn't even finish packing. I rebuilt the tent with hands that trembled and relit the lantern with the last of the gas, and when I unzipped the flap, I left it. Why no hesitation this time? No, pretending it wasn't what I wanted, what I needed. That he came back just after dark, the moment the stars returned. So did he, without a sound, without force, like he'd been there all along. He didn't settle right away. He paced once inside the tent, head low, ears rotating like radar. He was still listening for danger, still watching the dark, so I wouldn't have to. I lay on the floor beside him, shoulder to flank, his body radiated warmth into the chill air, and as I closed my eyes, a thought formed. Uninvited but undeniable. I didn't want to leave anymore. Not the camp, not him, not this strange, quiet space we'd carved between species, between worlds. Sometime around midnight, I woke to a noise, not a growl, not a footstep. A soft, shuddering whimper from him. Mosey's body trembled once. A ripple of movement ran along his ribs, then faded. I sat up, watched him twitch in his sleep. He was dreaming, and it wasn't a good one. Without thinking, I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "Shh," I whispered. "You're here. You're safe." He stilled, exhaled, and pressed his side against mine. I didn't sleep again, not really, but I rested, wrapped in silence, wrapped in him. At dawn, I rose, unzipped the flap, stepped outside barefoot, breathing in the cold air. Behind me, Mosey stirred, but didn't follow. I turned to face him. He lay in the center of the tent, huge and calm and very, very real, and for the first time, I said it aloud, "I'm not going." Not yet, and if he understood me, which I think he did, he showed it the only way he knew how. He closed his eyes, and stayed. By the 10th night, I stopped checking the time. The world beyond this tent had grown dim, distant, like a forgotten photograph, fading under sun. I no longer counted the days. I measured time in his breathing. I in the weight of his body curled beside mine. I in the silence between us that wasn't emptiness, but knowing. Mosey had claimed the space without asking, and I had let him. Every night, he came, sometimes after sunset, sometimes closer to midnight, but he always came. The first few minutes were always the same, a circle, a pause, the low rumble in his throat as he settled onto the mat, his back brushing the canvas, his great head resting just inches from mine. He took the whole space, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel crowded. I felt seen and chosen, safe. On the 11th morning, I stepped outside and found footprints, fresh, boot prints again, but this time there were more, and they were closer. One set circled the camp, another had stopped just near the edge of the tent. Whoever they were, they had come close enough to listen, close enough to smell the lion, and still, they came. I reported it over the satellite line. I didn't mention Mosey. I said I was extending my stay, that conditions were too unpredictable to relocate, that I needed more time, and they let me have it. That afternoon, I climbed a hill just west of camp, where I could see for miles. The plains stretched endlessly, a sea of gold and dust, dotted with brush and flickering with heat. But what struck me most wasn't the distance. It was the quiet, the complete, humming stillness of a world before language. And in the middle of it all, I felt it again, that sense, that pull. I turned. Mosey was there, standing below the hill, looking up at me, like he'd followed my scent through the wind, not to stop me this time, but simply to be nearer. That night, I didn't wait inside. I stood outside the tent as dusk swallowed the sun and let him come to me, and when he arrived, I said it for the first time, "Stay as long as you need." He blinked slowly, and stepped forward. He took the space again, his back pressed against the wall, his flanks stretched from corner to corner. I'd long since moved my bedding to accommodate him. My sleeping roll became thinner, my side of the tent narrower, but I didn't mind. I never once asked for my space back, because I had been given something far greater, trust. His and mine. Around midnight, I heard it again, cracked, a dry branch snapping, too sharp for wind, too heavy for a bird. I sat up slowly. Mosey did too, not with fear, with focus. He rose, powerful and silent, moving toward the tent flap without a sound. I followed, barefoot, heart pounding. He stopped just short of the opening and sniffed the air, his ears rotated. He turned toward me, his eyes flashing once, and then he stepped outside. The wind was colder than expected. It swept across the flat earth with a strange urgency, carrying scents I couldn't name. I stayed near the flap, watching. Mosey stood just beyond the light, his body tall and ready. Then I saw it, movement. Point 2. Men creeping along the outer edge of the brush line, rifles slung over their shoulders. Point 1 held binoculars. The other something heavier, long and dark and unmistakably dangerous. They hadn't seen me, but they had seen him. Mosi didn't growl, didn't roar. He simply took a step forward, another, his mane lifted in the wind like fire, and the men stopped dead. In their tracks, the one with the gun hesitated, raised it slightly, then lowered it, the other whispered something and pointed, then. Like smoke, they disappeared into the trees again, gone, but not forgotten. Mosi returned slowly, his body still tense, his steps deliberate. He entered the tent again, but this time, he didn't lie down. He remained standing between me and the door. A wall of breath and muscle, watching and waiting, and I realized, I wasn't just his tentmate, I was his to protect. I didn't sleep, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, reverence, for what he'd done, for the way he had made this space into something sacred, not a camp, not a hideout, but a place where something wild could become something whole. When dawn broke, he didn't stir. He stayed where he was, his back still to me, his eyes on the opening. I sat beside him and whispered, I think it's time. He didn't move, but I saw it in the way his ears lowered. He knew that afternoon, I packed again, not because I was afraid, but because I knew our time here was finished. What needed to happen had already happened, what needed to be protected had been. Before I collapsed the tent, I took one last photo, not of the landscape, not of the prints in the dirt, but of the inside, the wrinkled mat, the dented kettle, the place where his fur had worn down the fabric in the corner. A memory, a truth. A space that had been shared. He followed me to the vehicle like he always did, silent, steady, but this time, he didn't block me. He stood beside the door, and looked up at me one last time, those gold eyes, still sure, unapologetically lion-eye. Leaned down and placed a hand to the top of his mane. He didn't flinch, and I whispered, thank you, Mosi. Then I drove away, yet he didn't follow, and not this time. He turned back toward the plains, and disappeared into the golden dust of his world, and maybe, somewhere deep inside the wilderness, under the weight of sun and sky, he curled up again in a quiet, tent-shaped space, and rested, knowing he was never forgotten, because he took the whole space, and I let him willingly, gratefully, completely. The end.